So the first question I have is for Shawn. In conducting local research on missing middle housing, what has been the biggest surprise?
I guess that, and maybe this isn't surprising to many of you, but two things. One is how much is actually being developed right now that could be considered missing middle, even though it may not have all of those characteristics that Dan kind of would like to focus on. But there is a lot of stuff being developed right now. But I think the biggest surprise is just starting out on this process. I live in an older community, and I've walked those streets for the past 8 years, and until I started working on this report, I hadn't seen all of that missing middle housing in my neighborhood. There's a house that is, I walk out in my front yard, and I look down the street, and I could literally hit it with a stone. It's at the on the next street over, and it's a triplex that I thought was a single family house forever for 7.5 years, and then it's like, what the heck? Because I started looking for extra doors and extra mailboxes, and to see all that stuff that is integrated in communities, and then you go out to like all of the stuff that's being developed in again, like we were talking about earlier, Daybreak, but then just all over the place, some of this, the cool stuff that Brighton Homes is doing, and all of these developments. I think that there maybe is a little bit of momentum, and I think with some of the right zoning tweaks and or maybe complete overhauls, we could see a lot more of this stuff and have it a lot more easy for a lot more people to develop this and make it make sense for everybody, so that, like the mayor was saying, that our kids and grandkids can buy a house someday.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is for Nate Pugsley, who's the CEO of Brighton Homes, who's building missing middle product all along the Wasatch Front. And the question is, what is the biggest obstacle in building missing middle housing that you've seen in the Wasatch Front so far?
For sure, zoning is the number one problem, and getting a willing seller to sell. I mean, those are our two biggest obstacles. If we have those two come together, a landowner that's willing to sell and the correct zoning, we can make it happen. I think North Salt Lake, that Natalie represents, is a good example where we've done 4 or 5 projects where they changed the zoning along their Highway 89 to encourage redevelopment. And within a few years, it started to happen quickly. We're the entrepreneurship capital of the world in Utah, and there's a developer on every corner that wants the opportunity if they can get it. So.
That's great, thank you. All right, actually, the next question is for Natalie. So Natalie, North Salt Lake has seen an increase of missing middle housing type. How have your residents responded to you as an elected official?
When I ran for city council 2 years ago, I was actually on the planning commission, and we had just approved one of Nate's projects. And no one called me a development whore to my face. But like literally, they came in day one to the planning commission and they said, we can fit 24. And I said, how about 16? We fought with the community forever. And not all of the community, just the people right there who lived in duplexes across the street and didn't want townhouses. And no one wants to tear the old orchard down, but the guy doesn't want to own the old orchard anymore. We ended up with 16 units, and we currently have 2 candidates for council that will be elected in a few weeks that are not pro-development at all. So I'm a little concerned because I feel like right now everyone on our council has served as a planning commissioner. And so we know, and we have Ted Knowlton, so we know what we're doing. And we're trying, I know Ted, everyone, we're trying to make opportunities for everyone to come to North Salt Lake and to have a great place to live. And we are actually doing transit-oriented development before we get the transit. I mean, we are that far ahead. And I just feel like as long as we keep it off the hill, and as long as, like I love the idea of duplexes just in the middle of a neighborhood, but I'm not convinced that people in my community would want them. We have a 3-acre lot in my subdivision right now where there are courtyard homes and apartments and then 1 row of houses, and no one wants townhouses there. And so I think everyone needs to realize we all lived in different types of houses. We all want community members from different places in life and from different needs in life. And honestly, if it had been 10 years later, my husband and I would have bought one of Nate's townhouses. So people want them when they want them, or for their kids, but we have a lot of pushback, and the pushback's the loudest instead of the acceptance.
Great. Thank you. Okay, the next question is for Representative Waldrip. How do you see missing middle housing types fitting into legislative actions that we might see in the upcoming session?
As far as legislation goes, I think what we'll see is a beginning to look at regional solutions. I think we've all seen this. We've seen some of this today. We've heard from different experts today that we do this amazing regional planning. We have Andrew Gruber here and his team with Wasatch Front Regional Council. Everybody participates in all of this regional planning. And we come up with these amazing regional plans, and we dedicate billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to these infrastructure programs. We do mass transit, we do bus rapid transit, we do freeway off-ramps, we create all of these corridors. And then once that is done, we allow communities to go back and kind of retread on that same ground to determine what the zoning ends up being. So they've had their chance to come in and pitch the zoning and talk about the zoning and talk about where it makes sense to have density. And then we come back and we say, oh, unless you have a group of citizens that gets really upset, in that case, you can back out. And now we've spent, literally hundreds of millions of dollars on something that no longer makes sense because we don't put density in the places where everyone agrees it makes sense to do that. So I think we have to look at that from a regional standpoint. And the other thing I think we have to look at is regional planning support. Part of the problem I think that we've had with density is bad density is really unhelpful for the creation of future density. We've all seen areas where you have density that doesn't work. You have parking issues, you have open space issues, and so when you go to a group of residents and say, hey, we're going to put a fourplex here and a condo complex here, and we're going to do some townhomes here, what comes up in their mind? The worst thing that they've ever seen, their nightmare, it's the Halloween moment of, and they think, okay, this is going to be horrible. It's going to destroy my property values. They're going to hurt my kids. All of these negative things come up because we've allowed bad design and bad density to happen. So we have to find a way to support communities to create intelligent density like we've seen today, appealing density. Density, and from an economic standpoint, there are several studies where density does not actually diminish the value of nearby single-family homes. Very compelling evidence in studies. So it's not an economic impact, but it is an emotional impact if it's not done right. And so I think we as a state need to provide resources to our local entities to help them get it right so that their citizens can start to have faith that if we're going to do density, we're going to do it in the right way, we're going to do it intelligently, we're going to do it aesthetically pleasing, and it's going to be a plus for the community instead of a negative for the community. And I think if we do that right, we can start to change that narrative of density equals death, destruction, crime, disease, all of these negative things, and we can start to see it as density as an opportunity for our kids and our grandkids to stay home. Right now, I'm very concerned we have a brain drain going on. Our young people cannot find housing here in Utah, so where do they go? Somewhere else. That will come back to haunt us if we don't solve this problem. Thanks.
Representative Waldrip. Okay, our next question is for Dan. From what you've seen nationally and what you know about Utah, what are the next steps for Utah to take in utilizing missing middle housing types more effectively?
Well, they'll need a study to answer that question, but no. I think that in a place like Salt Lake City, there's enough momentum building, it seems, just based on the existing conditions and how unaffordable the region has become and how much growth is happening, that I just get a sense there's enough different partners at the table now that want to find a solution or many solutions that are necessary. But I think the implementation is going to be hard, but it's absolutely necessary to get the implementation right. I'm just going to, I hate to be overly critical, but to your point about scary density is Salt Lake City has some of the most unattractive TODs of anywhere I've seen in the country. And I think it's been a detriment because I think people see that, and that's what happened first. And they're like, we don't want that, right? And so there is some backpedaling, some additional education that needs to happen. But, as I was thinking about this just now is, I think the one city, which is also a county, that did this most effectively was the Nashville-Davidson County planning staff. And Rick Bernhardt was one of my mentors, and he created an urban design studio that had a very specific skill set that was kind of a separate SWAT team within his broader planning staff that knew how to execute, they knew how to partner with developers, they knew exactly what policy and zoning changes that needed to be made. So I could see maybe not just one urban design studio, but maybe there's, throughout the region, I don't know what the geography is, but there's a series of urban design studios that deliver that support. And somebody on that team probably knows how to run a pro forma, right? But somebody else is like, what Stephen and Jeff do at Daybreak, like they know like how to talk to the builder to get to a high quality project. And somebody knows the master planning, how do we communicate with the neighbors? So that's one thing I might recommend, that just came to my mind is like a series of urban design studios that can really lead to high quality implementation, I feel would be really, really effective here.
So I want to jump off that point that Dan just mentioned and open this really up to all of the panelists. And it goes with one of the questions that we pulled as well, is it's part of what makes the projects in Tempe and the historic building in Sacramento so appealing is good design. So how do your local governments promote design of that caliber, particularly when in recent times, I think public entities have actually discouraged design guidelines and things kind of happening at the local level. Those things are in conflict with each other. I think what we were seeing here were photographs of designs we'd all like to see in our communities, but we also have this undercurrent of don't tell me how to design my building. So how do we resolve that? Any ideas? And who should be in charge of getting the design studios going? So it's two questions. Who plays that role, Dan, in your mind, most effectively in the communities that you've been involved in? And then I'd love to hear from the other panelists about this seeming contradiction that we have in our communities.
The three of the case studies I presented that we worked on have proven that good design does not have to be expensive, because not a single one of those projects was targeted at a high end of the market. They were all, the Daybreak Muse were at any middle income household, initially at least. We hit the target before the market exploded, could afford to buy one of those. The project in Nebraska has a lower end of the rent that somebody who's making a minimum wage can actually afford that smallest apartment. And there's a lot of design that went into that. It's just like we challenged ourselves and over the past 5 years in particular to prove that good design can be executed and not be expensive. And I think that's part of the message. It's not just you have to throw money at it to get good design. It's just there's a real nuanced approach to that. Like, what does it take to get good design? And you don't need to throw money at it. So I want to make that point first, because that's usually the discussion point, is like, good design does not equal expensive. It shouldn't. But the challenge in sort of tying into that second point is that not a lot of people have that skill set, unfortunately, right? You can't just expect any builder and any architect to be able to come in and deliver that. So like part of what Rick Bernhardt did in his urban design studios is he he used his networks all across the country to recruit or to find the local, talent, with that right skill set to bring into his team to make that happen. And so they sort of led the citywide plan, which had a strong missing middle component and a strong equity component. They led the neighborhood level area planning, and they led the form-based code writing for all of those areas. And then they also led that back and forth with the builders. And the execution, I think, is generally really good in Nashville. People might complain about the rate of change, but that's a different problem because Nashville is another exploding market. So the second part was where the urban design studio should reside? Is that, or who
Well,
should?
yeah, is that something that, as many government agencies in this room today, is that a baton they should pick up? Is it really the private sector? I mean, I'd love to
No,
hear.
it's public sector for sure. And there just needs to be some sort of a partnership that happens that may be something that's never happened before, right? It's that outside the box thinking. Like in one of our very first project, UC Santa Barbara County and the Santa Barbara County Parks District created a joint venture of sorts to tackle this really complex issue they had with housing in this community next to the university, and that had never happened before. They'd never sort of been at the table before and said, we're going to set the same goals and cooperate to get to meet that goal. So I think that sort of thing needs to happen. I'm happy to participate in discussion. I'm not sure exactly what the formal structure of that is, but it should definitely be public sector. And just to give you a sense of, similar to the role of what the Daybreak Design Review team does with Jeff and Stephen and others is, right, they do a cyclical process. We've played that same role for municipalities, where they knew the first new urbanist and form-based code application in California was for a several hundred acre dynamite plant about 15 miles north of the heart of the Bay Area, 15 miles north of Oakland. And right, the city hired us to function as that design studio. So when a project then made it to the Planning Commission, the first thing the Planning Commission asked was, well, did the Urban Design Studio approve this? And if they said no, the Planning Commission would just say, well, you need to go back and first get the approval of the Urban Design Studio, otherwise we don't want to waste our time on this, because it's not a negotiation up here. You should be working with our team to figure this out. And that's why I think it's probably important to have an economist as part of that too. So, there's numbers involved in that conversation as well.
So I would ask sort of Nate and Steve if you have responses to what Dan is just talking about based on kind of what has happened at the legislature in the past regarding design. And then I think, Nate, at some point, developers feel that any design review slows the process down, it's going to cost you money. So can you respond either of you want to respond to what Dan was talking about?
Yeah, I do think that developers feel like they should have some say, but there are some like me that are colorblind. And so I can't, we have to have people on our team that are good at it. And there are a lot of developers, North Salt Lake is a good example, that didn't get the colors right. And it wouldn't have taken any more work or much more review from the city to actually get it right. Layton City is a good example. So outsourcing to a firm is a good idea. And I think that cities should do that, because sometimes you only have one crack at this. And when you get it wrong, it endures forever. In the case of Layton City, they have a little panel that in the approval process, you go to a volunteer panel full of architects and other experts in the city that are providing their time once a month. And you go to the panel, they've looked at your project in advance, and they give you advice and make recommendations, and you're encouraged to follow those. You don't have to, but most people do, because they want the approval at the end of the day. And I think stuff like that is important to do. The cities need to get more involved there.
I need to clarify, because I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreted. There needs to be a clearly defined objective path from start to finish of entitlement. It should not be a It should not be a subjective negotiation. It shouldn't be, oh, the architect on the design committee wants shake shingles and this other person wants purple on your railings. Like, you need to, whether it's you're starting with your zoning, and if you have guidelines, I'm generally not actually a big fan of design guidelines, but if you have them, they need to be objective. We actually, if you haven't been following the state of California, it is a requirement for every city now to have objective residential zoning standards or guidelines, whichever they have or both. So you can't say we want it to be human scale or, you know, we want it to be fit into the neighborhood. Like, it doesn't work anymore. Like, we're 3.5 million units short on housing, and we need to deliver housing. So I think I want to make sure, I wasn't suggesting it was like the urban design studio is this open negotiation. That's absolutely not what it should be. It should be you have really great zoning that's objective, and if you need some standard guide, like some sort of guidelines, like to supplement that, they need to be objective too. But it should be there still might be some back and forth, but it shouldn't be just like whatever's the flavor of the day sort of gets asked for, you know.
Yeah, I think this highlights one of the biggest challenges, is we have cost issues and pricing issues on the Wasatch Front, as other places in the country do. Last year, the legislature passed some new laws prohibiting municipalities from enacting some of those standards that may or may not have been the right thing to do. I don't know the answer to that. I think as I listen to what we're hearing here, I think we have to provide some level of support so that we can get that intelligent design, so we don't have those moments where everybody says, you said density. I think of this, you know, these horrible examples. We need to have good examples of it. And the push and pull of that is obviously the balance between what the private sector will want, which is control of costs and control of design and control of, you know, end product, because that's what we do in America. But it's got to be balanced against the public interest of delivering a quality experience and quality of life that, frankly, is what's bringing people to our state. So, you know, that's what I hear most often from people who are opposed to density is, you're going to ruin my quality of life. And so we have to be very, very judicious at guarding our quality of life here. And again, I think this can be done. I don't think this is an unsolvable problem. I don't think we have a Gordian knot here. I think we can figure this out, but it's going to take a concerted effort by everybody from the League of Cities and Towns and that group on the local, very local side to the legislature on the statewide scale to come together and create solutions that aren't based on sort of parochial, narrow ideas, but on broader ideals and broader, a broader view of how we attack this problem.
Can I just, that made me think of something that I often promote, but I forgot to mention it today, is publicly driven pilot projects on publicly owned land is an excellent way, partner with the right developer, but bring the land to the table and create your own model projects. I think that's a great way to ease the concerns and sort of create that project and series of projects you want to point to. I think it's a really great strategy, whether it's countywide or a city specific. I think it's really important. And toward the quality of life, the one thing I didn't mention about the missing middle neighborhood that we designed is that Papillion, Nebraska, which is the city is being developed in, has a long history of saying no to anything not single family. Like, they did not want multifamily in their community. But the mayor just saw the renderings. We did these renderings of the early vision of the project, and he said, this can reinforce our number one objective, which is maintaining the small town character, but also help us address the much needed housing attainability issue we're having. And he became the biggest champion, And he basically at some point he told his staff, like, we're going to build this. Like, you need to work with the developer here and we need to figure this out because this is what we need and want in our community.
Well, we have an interesting experiment in the state right now on this, is the point of the mountain development. And so that's something to watch closely because that is a master planned, top-down, driven project that I've seen some of the initial renderings, which the guidelines that they're trying to follow, everything's within 15 minutes walk, and you have access to mass transit, and some of those guidelines are critical, I think, to good design.
One of the things that I've noticed in our neighborhood, we don't have like a specific design center, but we've learned from things we've done in the past. And I love opportunities like this because then we can all get together and learn together about things. When we originally built the subdivision that I live in, we did tiny lot houses. And they didn't work. Well, they did work. People bought them and live in them. But it wasn't the look that we were going for. It wasn't the community feel we were wanting. And so we took that and made some adjustments before we went to the next phase of the development. And I feel like if we all get together and we say, oh, we tried that, it didn't work, or yeah, why don't you look at this? We've got planning associations, we've got League of Cities and Towns, we've got this group, we've got Wasatch Front Regional Council. We have enough experts in the room. We just have to talk to each other. And I think we have to be willing to do things like go walk through Daybreak, right? Go look and see what they've done and how that would work for your community.
Okay, this next question is a fun one. I think all of us can learn something from this question and take it with us. What is the first step to introducing this to a skeptic? And I would add to that, if you could help a skeptic start to open their mind a little bit to missing middle in their own neighborhood or even their own backyard of all places, what would you do? And Shawn, everything you've learned, what do you tell a skeptic?
It's about future generations and it's about us as we age and aging in places that are cool and that we can walk to, like Dan was talking about his great grandmother, like this idea that we can live in these places that are vibrant and have communities with the multiple generations in them instead of living I guess farther afield.
Shawn does a really good job with that when he shows us the pictures. Because if someone says, we're going to put a duplex on your street, and we picture it like the first picture in Shawn's presentation, we're like, no. Or that one that you had last week with the horrible garages. But if you say, you know what, you're going to need a place for your kids to move in when they're right out of college, and so we're going to try and work some duplexes through the community, and you won't be able to tell. And that's what Shawn's presentation does. I don't think you can just do it I think you have to have the pictures. You have to be able to show people it's not what you think. It's not the scary density monster that Representative Waldrip was talking about.
So Nate, if I were a landowner and you were trying to get me, and I've hired you to develop some properties for me, how would you turn my mind away from, oh no, it's got to be single family, my friend, on 1/3 of an acre lots? And you can tell me, not that I'm just going to make more money at the sale end of it, but what would you say to me to try to turn my mind to what you're developing up in North Salt Lake?
I think talking about your children always helps. And Dan talked about that, so did everybody else. But having your children live close by is everybody's dream, right? And that seems to always work. Have a place that they can afford.
Dan, what's your 20-second elevator pitch when you meet somebody for the first time?
It sounds very basic, but I always tell people to start with photographs. I mean, very few cities do it, and it says it in my book. It's like, don't overthink it. Create poster boards by category of all the regional examples and make them available on your city website, period. Put them up in your library. It's really accessible. Just that's how you need to start.
Steve, do you have any?
I think I would just recommend that people think big. Think 50 years in the future, 60 years in the future. What is this going to look like? What do we want to have happen? And then be brave enough to implement that vision.
I've been thinking in my head about the difference between some of the projects that we've had in our city and some of the projects that we saw today in Daybreak. And I really feel like as community leaders, we have a responsibility to try and meet this affordable housing crisis. But I also feel like I guess I'm not really good yet at picking out where to do it. Because I feel like if we said to Nate, okay, instead of 24 units, we want 12 with a really, really great trail system through it, or those big walkways. Immediately, we're raising the price. We're making it more expensive for you to develop, and you'll get less money from it. And so I want to figure out, and maybe this is a question for all the experts, is how do we find good design that also solves the problems? And it's that bad design that is hurting us in our communities, but we're trying to solve problems. And so everything ends up being a 3-story condo structure or something instead of something really great that fits in the community.
I mean, I just think that's why the pro forma analysis needs to be part of the conversation to inform like where's that sweet spot of amenity and quality versus, I guess, feasibility. We usually say there's like 3 criteria that we like to rate it by. Number one, is it feasible, right? It has to be feasible to a developer to be attractive just as a starting point. Is it delivering attainability, right? Is that if you're requiring too much open space, then you're going to get bigger, more expensive units. And then livability is both about what's the quality of living it's delivering within the project, but also how is it impacting, or is it impacting the people that are living next to it or across the street from it?
So this question has to do with about, in this presentation, there hasn't been much of a distinction between missing middle rental versus ownership, mostly because I think we were just talking about the building type and trying to get to know it a little bit better. But do we neglect how housing can help with wealth creation and achieving the American dream by ignoring that distinction? So I'd love responses about how does missing middle, how can it contribute to that idea of moving up the ladder in terms of family wealth and intergenerational wealth and the kinds of things that we see as anchoring a family in stability, financial stability by homeownership?
I can start with that because this is something I think about a lot. In my non-governmental life, I have a social benefit fund that I've started with that intent in mind. If you look at world history and recent world history, anytime the middle class has been squeezed and shrunk and sometimes gone out of existence in different countries, what follows is inevitable social upheaval. You think about the riots we had, over the last couple of years, where people feel disenfranchised. If all of a sudden we lose our middle class, those groups grow exponentially because they don't have a stake in the big game. They don't feel like participants. And so I think we have to confront the reality that we cannot simply think of warehousing people in apartments or in government subsidized housing. That will lead to problems down the road. We have to think in terms of how do we enable people to create personal wealth and generational wealth. And there's some really interesting literature. If you've read the book, The Color of Law, it talks about how African American and minority communities have been excluded since World War II, particularly from the opportunity to own real estate. And what do we see now? We see entire communities that don't have the opportunity, and the next generation can't access that generational wealth to go to college, to get, to have stability. So I think one of the things we'll look at in the legislature, just tying directly to the legislature, is right now there's an incredible barrier to building condominiums. There are some liability issues. Lenders won't lend on them. Designers don't want to have anything to do with them. You've got years-long liability, so nobody wants to touch them. And that's one of the entry points into the real estate market. And we've now, if you think about it, there are 2 condo development project going on right now or something like that. I mean, a ridiculously low amount. And so the bottom rung of the ladder to ownership is going higher and higher, which in turn creates a smaller and smaller little class. We need to, from a policy standpoint as policymakers, we need to make sure that our policies are clear and able to extend that ladder down lower so that more people can access that and get into an ownership situation where they're building equity. Otherwise, I worry for my kids' future.
The League in Cities and Towns conference last week, we were talking about affordable housing with deed restrictions on it, and I had never thought of that. But as a member of my community, if I'm going to provide affordable housing to people in my community, I first would want it to fit this missing middle, but I would want it also to be something that isn't just attainable today. I mean, you were talking about, Dan, you were talking about the Muse housing that you built and how it was affordable 5 years ago, but it's not anymore. And so allowing that balance between keeping something affordable and allowing people to earn equity, I think is a great opportunity. I don't know, I've never asked a developer, I've never asked the rest of my city council if we're willing to put money up to help with this. But I think stepping outside the box and looking for ways that you can provide housing that's affordable and attainable and attractive and fits in your communities is probably the sweet spot that if we knew how to do that, we wouldn't be here, I guess.
Can I just, I want to second removing the condo barriers. I actually feel that's next to zoning probably the biggest change that needs to happen, because you can only squeeze a unit so small in terms of getting to an attainable price point. And I think even your market's gotten beyond that to some point where you can't make especially for a family, you can't squeeze a unit small enough for it to be attainable without subsidy. And in terms of like a townhouse or a fee simple housing type, and we see this, and it's a bigger problem in about 3 or 4 states that have the most onerous construction defect liability state laws. That, I mean, if you can imagine, if there's a developer's not willing to develop a 150 unit condo building because the liability is too high, you're sure not going to get a developer to build an 8-plex or a 4-plex and take on the liability of a condo. So I would agree. I think that there are a lot of ways in which you think of the basic 4-plex that I show with the 2 units at the bottom and the 2 units on the top. You can imagine how great of a quality of living that could deliver to somebody if each one of those units was a condo in a house scale missing middle building. So I think that's a huge barrier that, yeah, definitely need to get beyond. And I would say, I know the state of Washington is tackling that right now. I haven't kept up with it over the last 6 months, but it'd be interesting to see how they've made progress. And unfortunately, California doesn't seem to be making much progress on that front. But
So this next question, I think many of us have thought about this. Are there solutions to incorporating missing middle housing in largely built out suburbs where infill potential is on mostly small lots scattered in an auto-dependent area? So is there a role for missing middle in our existing suburbia where it could actually be?
Well, certainly Dan was talking about like these transitional areas, and if if you're closer to major roads, but also if you're looking at redeveloping defunct shopping malls, for instance, maybe you can create a little bit more. I almost said the density word. Well, now I just said it. But you could get pack some more units in there than maybe you're getting in the surrounding areas in those suburban communities.
A really great job with infill. So you'll see a lot of Nate's projects will be like the most recent one that I remember is one where a family owned 2 lots. And they were 2 pretty big lots. They were on a main street. And they sold the lots with the 2 60-year-old houses on them. And we were able to turn that into 14 really lovely townhouses. And it still had that neighborhood feel. So infill really works for us, and allowing different uses on the current zone. So if my neighbor's house burned down, currently they couldn't put a duplex there when they rebuilt. But if they could, that would solve a problem. I don't want my neighbor's house to burn down. I'm sorry I said that. But you know, just like if you've got these lots in the area that maybe are zoned for single family or something, but they're kind of the outliers, maybe that's something you can look at as well.
Go ahead. I was just going to mention HB 82 last year gave the right to, I guess you would say 75% of the homeowners in Utah to build an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, within the confines of their existing home. And cities have the ability to sort of manage that, make sure it happens in the right areas without going into areas where it shouldn't. But that's one way individuals can create some value within their own real estate that's existing, and also help to alleviate that concern of infill in existing areas without burning down your neighbor's home. But that's one thing, and it hasn't, I don't think, been widely adopted. I don't think it's been widely used, but that's something that may have an impact.
So we have an ADU ordinance in North Salt Lake that we did before the legislature, and we were actually a little bit mad at the legislature because when you have a city built on a hill that gets a lot of lake effect snow, you really want off-street parking. And that was something that we could not negotiate with the legislature. But our ADU ordinance, we are seeing people come into our city probably 2 or 3 times a week, maybe, that are looking into doing that. And so I think that's a great way. We have a neighboring city, who I'm not going to mention, I should mention them, who just had a new subdivision, and they were building houses with mother-in-law apartments, and the city asked them to stop. And I just think that kind of short-sightedness that all of us have to be aware of, because the homes looked just like every other home on the street, but it was another option that the city had taken away.
I'm glad that I love ADUs, and I think it's a really good first step, and glad to hear that it's moving through some legislation. The state of California now, I think 3 years adopted state ADU legislation because the local agencies, unfortunately, were just not delivering. And to my point is, like, I feel like just the task is, let's deliver this at a local level and not make it have to come down from the top. But it actually wasn't until and then it went through its refinements, which is great. It has to, like, every 6 months it's being adjusted as it should be, but it actually not much was getting built until they removed the parking requirement. And that was the only point at which people started building ADUs. And I know it's a big mental shift, but most lots actually don't have the space for parking. So it's kind of that trade-off in, would you rather have a perceived parking problem or a actual housing problem? Is kind of like, I think it's, even on my block, there's 3 ADUs under construction. And it's kind of the great typical stories. The old couple who's lived in the neighborhood for 50 years has kids and their kids and the grandkids who can't afford to buy a place. So they're building the ADU for themselves, and their kids and grandkids are going to move in the front. We tell those stories, but it's actually happening now in my neighborhood. So now I can actually point and I can show pictures. So I think ADUs are a great start. And I don't know how the legislation is written here, but in California, it can be an attached ADU or a detached ADU. So somebody could actually, a baby boomer living in a big 4-bedroom house that they don't need 4 bedrooms after their kids move away. They could actually carve out a piece of that existing footprint and make it an ADU. That's the way it works in California. So, and I think that's actually pretty smart too, because economically it's easier to justify too.
Can I just quickly say, as a city official, we want to solve these problems. I want to solve these problems without the legislature, but I look at surrounding cities who feel like, well, we're just going to ignore the problems. And if that's happening, then the legislature is going to step in and solve the problem. So if there is a city that's still requiring half-acre lots, guess what? Someone's going to come in and solve that problem, and I don't want the rest of the cities to lose the ability to require half-acre lots when it's appropriate. And so I feel like we all have a responsibility to fix it and to work with each other to fix it and not just expect somebody else to do the heavy lifting, because everyone keeps saying we don't want to be California. We don't want the governor saying all of a sudden you can put a 10-plex on any street and you can put a tiny house in every yard. But if we can't solve the problem still has to be solved. And the local level is the best place to do it. So keep coming to these meetings and doing that.
Keep being mad at me.
It's not you, it's Ray Ward, sorry.
I know. I like Ray too.
Thank you. We're about ready to wrap up, and we'd like to know if our panel has any closing remarks or wisdom they would like to impart.
You know, this is just one of a whole bunch of options that I think we are all going to be facing over the next, the coming decades. But it seems like this isn't that difficult. It's not this difficult problem to solve. I mean, we've got the ADU thing pretty well figured out. We're letting the cat out of the bag in terms of like letting people know that maybe there's some money to be made in making some, building some of this missing middle stuff. But I think that with some changes, some communities are getting, I guess, a little bit more creative and stepping outside of their comfort zone with form-based code and other things. And I think that this is one, it's not that heavy of a lift to really develop a lot more homes through this kind of missing middle approach. And basically just, we need the supply. I mean, Dan was talking about this, the increasing costs. If we can get more homes out there for people to live in, that's the key at the end of the day.
I would just say from a planning perspective, both I guess at the city and the county level, so I just want to encourage you all to think outside of the box in terms of planning approaches, planning tools, planning products, because it's just so frustrating because I see all these really well-intended efforts that are still using the same process and the same product that they've used for 30, 40 years to try to solve a problem that process has been ineffective in solving. And so like, it may take like even just a comprehensive planning process, like, right? California cities spend up $2 million on a general plan, citywide comprehensive plan, and then they don't have any money to spend on a zoning code update. That's actually what's needed to implement it based on what the state requires. But actually, and now they're requiring like this housing element update, which has failed to actually deliver the choice, and they're dumping a bunch of money in that. So I'm like, well, how is that tool that was ineffective in solving this problem in the first place gonna now all of a sudden solve the problem? So I'm just want to encourage innovative thinking. Don't be afraid to think outside the box, bring a multidisciplinary sort of group to the table, bring the development community to the table. And I think it's not gonna be easy. If it were easy, we would have solved it, right? We wouldn't be in this situation. So I just encourage that really big outside the box thinking.
I know Nate, he's got something wise to say.
Is the Housing Gap Coalition came up with a study that said that within one generation or 27 years, the average home would be $800,000, I think is what they said. But with the last year and a half with COVID and the in-migration from California and other states, it really feels like that has accelerated dramatically. And so the urgency to do something seems to have, we've seen as the seller of homes, we've seen the craziness of people just desperately wanting a house. And it's been nice from our perspective because if we had 10 offers on a house and had been bid up 30 or 40,000, we could at least pick that family that was going to live there themselves rather than an investor. And so that was at least in our control. but we feel really badly for people that haven't been able to find a place to live. And we've received the notes, and they send their resume with their family picture, and it's just heartbreaking to see how many people are in need of it that can't afford it. And so I think the urgency really is there. I see it with my children who are graduating and starting to have kids, that they don't have a lot of hope for buying a house anytime soon. And I think all of us have situations like that. So the urgency is really there.
I would say as closing, there's an amazing clip from a show called Ted Lasso, and you don't have to admit to have watched it, but he quotes, and I wish you see it, and if you want a 2-minute clip that you can show anywhere and use in almost any situation, just see me afterward, I'll show you where it is. The statement is, be curious, not judgmental. And that is what we need in our society right now. We need that in our leadership right now. We've got a leader here who is curious, not judgmental. I mean, she's willing to explore options and to think largely instead of simply reacting emotionally to the scary words of density and ADUs and these other things. We have to encourage that line of thought in our elected leaders, in our appointed officials, and in our design professionals and builders to be curious about how to solve this problem, because I think the solutions are there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's give our panel a hand. Thank you, and thank you for the questions. There were a lot of them. We're gonna type them up, and we'll put them on our website. We have a county missing middle website, so we'll put them there. And thank you to our fine videographers here today. These videos will be made available to you in the future, and we'll make some little video clips as well if you want to see some of the highlight reel of this. I'd like to end with thanking our co-sponsor, Larry H. Miller Real Estate, presenting sponsors AARP, Rio Tinto, Kennecott, UTA, Utah League of Cities and Towns, Wasatch Front Regional Council, Congress for New Urbanism Utah Chapter, APA Utah, Utah Foundation, and Urban Land Institute. And then also I want to give a shout out and a thanks to our regional development team who's worked on this. They put in a lot of hours and hard work. Tiffany Marquez, Vanessa Williams, Carrie Marsh, Jordan Carroll, Toby Lowry, and Brittany Hemingway, and my boss, Dina Blaze, for supporting this and letting us put this time into it. So thank you to everyone for coming, and have a nice day.